Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Mind. Tonight, we are turning attention towards something that is happening right now, even as you listen. Something so constant and so close that it is almost always overlooked entirely. Not because it is hidden, but because it is so thoroughly present that the mind mistakes it for the air itself. Watching thoughts is not a technique invented by meditation teachers or studied into existence by neuroscientists. It is a capacity that has been with the human mind for as long as the human mind has existed. The ability to notice what is happening inside the head, to step back just slightly from the stream of ideas and images and words and recognize it as a stream rather than as the whole of reality. That small, quiet act turns out to change everything. It is one of the gentler paradoxes of inner life. Thinking is constant, and yet it is possible to watch thinking without being entirely swept away by it. The thought is real, and yet the one who notices the thought is also real and is not the same as the thought. The mind fills with words, images, plans, memories, and quiet anxieties. And yet, underneath all of that motion, something remains that is not moving at all. Even now, as your day releases its hold and the night settles around you, thoughts are still arriving. Fragments of conversation, small worries returning for one more visit. A memory surfacing without invitation. This is the ordinary texture of a human mind at rest, and there is nothing wrong with any of it. Tonight, we are simply going to look at it together, slowly and without judgment, the way you might watch rain move across a window. If these quiet journeys into sleep are something you find yourself returning to, I would gently invite you to subscribe to the Sleepy Mind or leave a like on your way to sleep. It helps more tired and curious people find their way here. For now, let your body settle into whatever surface is holding it. Let your hands rest without needing to hold anything. Let your breath find its own pace without any effort from you at all. We are going somewhere very close tonight. Closer, perhaps, than anywhere we have ever gone. Let's begin. The practice has a name that sounds almost too simple to be useful. Watching thoughts. It sounds like something anyone might do on a slow afternoon, sitting by a window, letting the mind drift and occasionally noticing that it has drifted. And in a sense, that casual, half-aware glancing at one's own mental activity is not entirely different from what formal practice asks. The difference is in the intention, in the steadiness, in the willingness to stay with the watching long enough to discover what it actually reveals. In psychology, this capacity is given the name metacognition, from the Greek word for beyond and the Latin word for knowledge. It means, simply, thinking about thinking. The mind turning its attention back on itself. Not to analyze or judge what it finds, not to correct or improve it, but simply to notice that mental activity is happening and to observe its qualities as they arise. This noticing, modest as it appears, is where a long and serious human investigation begins. Metacognition is considered a distinctly human capacity. Researchers believe that while some great apes may show rudimentary signs of self-awareness, the sustained and deliberate observation of one's own thought processes appears to be something the human nervous system developed in a particularly elaborate form. It is one of the quieter achievements of the long evolutionary journey that produced the human mind, and it is available to anyone at any moment without any equipment or preparation at all. That is perhaps one of its most remarkable qualities. It requires nothing from the outside world. It requires only a turning of attention. The most fundamental thing the practice rests on is a distinction that sounds simple and turns out to be quite profound. The distinction between the thought and the one who notices the thought. When a thought arises, there is the thought itself, and there is something else, something that is aware of the thought's arrival. In ordinary experience, these two things collapse together so quickly that they seem to be a single thing. The thought arrives, and the mind is already inside it, already following it, already treating it as if it were solid ground rather than something passing through. Practice is, in large part, the slow and patient work of learning to feel the difference between these two things. It is worth being clear about what this practice is not. Watching thoughts is not about stopping thoughts. Thoughts do not stop. The human mind generates mental activity the way the body generates warmth, continuously, without being asked, without being able to easily stop. Attempting to prevent thoughts from arising is an endeavor that practice teachers across many traditions describe as not only futile, but unnecessary. The problem is not that thoughts arise. The problem is the particular relationship the mind tends to form with them without any deliberate awareness. That relationship, in its ordinary unexamined form, tends toward immediacy. A thought arrives and it is believed. A thought arrives and it is followed. A thought arrives and it becomes a plan, or a worry, or a story about oneself, or a memory that expands to fill the room. The thought is rarely questioned. It is rarely held at any distance. It is rarely seen as a thought at all, in the sense of being seen as a temporary, contingent, provisional event in the mind, rather than as an accurate report about the world. This is simply how the untrained mind operates. It is not a failure, it is a habit, and habits, given patient attention, can change. What watching does, when practiced with patience and consistency, is introduce a small but significant amount of space between the thought and the response to the thought. Not so much space that the thought becomes irrelevant, not so much distance that the mind becomes cold or detached from its own experience. Just enough room that what is happening can be seen before it is automatically acted upon. This is sometimes described as a gap, or a pause, or a breath between stimulus and response. It is a very small thing. It changes the texture of a life in ways that are difficult to measure and easy to feel. The practice does not require a particular setting or a particular posture. Thoughts can be watched while sitting quietly, while walking, while preparing a meal, while lying in the particular softness of a bed on the edge of sleep. The instruction is the same in any circumstance. Simply notice that thinking is happening, not what the thought contains, not whether it is a good thought or a bad one, not whether it is useful or a distraction. Simply, there is thinking here. That noticing, quiet and undramatic as it is the whole of what is being asked. And in that simplicity, something opens. Researchers in cognitive science describe the mental activity that runs through a person's waking hours as the work of what is called the default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions that become most active when the mind is not focused on a specific external task. This network generates planning, memory, self-referential thinking, and the kind of diffuse and wandering mental activity that most people are familiar with when they sit quietly and find that the mind immediately fills with a particular kind of noise. The default mode network is not a problem. It is the mind doing what it has evolved to do. But it is also where watching begins, because it is the mental activity most easily confused with reality rather than recognized as process. What begins as the simple act of noticing gradually deepens into something less easily described. The watcher becomes more reliable. The gap between thought and response becomes more available. And something else, quieter and more stable than any particular thought, begins to become recognizable as the ground in which all of this is happening. That ground is what the practice is quietly moving toward, and it has been moving toward it in one form or another for a very long time. The history of this movement, the long human inquiry into what it means to watch one's own mind, stretches back further than almost any other organized form of inner practice. And it does not belong to any single tradition, any single century, or any single part of the world. The observation of one's own thoughts is not a modern discovery. It is one of the oldest sustained investigations in human history, pursued with extraordinary seriousness across cultures that had no contact with each other, and arriving at conclusions that are quietly similar in ways that reward careful attention. The earliest surviving formal descriptions of thought watching as a structured practice appear in Buddhist texts dating to at least the 5th century before the Common Era. These texts form part of what is called the Pali Canon, the oldest complete body of Buddhist scripture, preserved in Pali, an ancient Indian language related to Sanskrit and maintained with meticulous care across centuries of monastic transmission. Within the Pali Canon, there is a discourse of particular importance to this practice. It describes an approach called satipatthana, a word that translates roughly as the foundations of mindfulness or the basis of presence. Satipatthana outlines 4 domains in which sustained attention is practiced: the body and its sensations, feeling tone, meaning the basic quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that accompanies every experience, states of mind, and what is translated as mental objects, which includes thoughts, images, and the processes of thinking itself. The texts describe the practice of sitting with each of these domains and simply observing what arises within them, without preference, without intervention, without the attempt to make things be different from what they are. The instruction is precise and also remarkably gentle. Watch, notice, return. What is striking about this early formulation is that it treats thought watching not as a specialized or advanced practice, but as a foundational one, something basic to the entire project of understanding the mind. Something that begins not with dramatic concentration states or elaborate philosophical preparation, but with the quiet and patient willingness to look. The ordinary mind, this teaching says, contains everything needed for the investigation. One does not need to travel elsewhere. The practice begins exactly where one already is. On the other side of the world, in the Mediterranean world of ancient Greece and Rome, philosophers were arriving at a parallel understanding through an entirely different route. The Stoic tradition, flourishing roughly between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 2nd century of the Common Era, placed enormous emphasis on what its practitioners called prosos. This Greek term is sometimes translated as attention to oneself or self-watching. It described the practice of observing one's own mental impressions, the automatic interpretations and reactions the mind generates in response to events before choosing how to respond to them. The Stoics understood that it is not events themselves that disturb a person, but the interpretation placed on events. And they understood that interpretations arise in the form of thoughts, quickly and automatically, before the conscious mind has had a chance to examine them. Prososh was the practice of slowing that automatic process down enough to see what was happening inside it. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who practiced Stoic philosophy throughout his public life, wrote extensively in his private journals about the discipline of watching his own mind, noticing where it is going, and choosing, where possible, to redirect it towards steadiness and proportion. These journals were never intended for publication. They were a private practice of witnessing, carried on across years of demanding public life, in the quiet intervals between one responsibility and the next. The early Christian contemplative tradition, particularly the desert fathers and mothers who withdrew to the Egyptian and Syrian deserts in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, developed a practice they called nepsis, sometimes translated as watchfulness or sobriety of mind. Nepsis involved the careful observation of thoughts as they approached the threshold of consciousness, before they had taken hold and begun to influence mood, speech, or behavior. The desert teachers wrote about logismoi, a Greek term for the thoughts or inner voices that arose uninvited, and described the practice of learning to recognize them at their first arising, without immediately following or feeding them. This is a strikingly precise description of what modern meditation instruction calls noticing the thought before being captured by it. The desert tradition arrived at the same basic insight through a completely different philosophical framework, suggesting that what they were pointing toward was something about the structure of mind itself, rather than a culturally specific observation. Different languages, different centuries, different continents, different cosmologies, and yet the same essential instruction. Watch the thought arrive. See it clearly. Do not follow it without choosing to. In the Jewish mystical tradition of Musar, which was developed primarily in 19th century Lithuania by teachers such as Rabbi Israel Salanter, practitioners were trained in the sustained observation of their own habitual thought patterns, their characteristic tendencies of mind, their recurring emotional reactions, and the stories the self told about itself. The goal was not psychological insight in the modern therapeutic sense, though that insight often arose. The goal was moral refinement, the gradual alignment of thought, feeling, and action with deeply held values. Watching the mind was understood as the necessary first step in working with it. One cannot change what one has not seen, and seeing, in this tradition, was itself a form of practice. The Indian philosopher Patanjali, writing in what is known as the Yoga Sutras, a text composed somewhere around the 2nd century of the Common Era, offered a definition of the entire practice of yoga that centers on the observation of mental activity. Yoga, in Patanjali's formulation, is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Those fluctuations are called vrittis, meaning whirlpools or movements. The practice is not the elimination of vrittis, but the capacity to observe them without being spun by them. The one who watches the whirlpool from the bank, rather than being caught in its current, is the one who has begun to understand what practice is. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which developed an extraordinarily sophisticated vocabulary for describing the nature of mind, placed the recognition of thoughts as temporary mental events at the very center of some of its most direct approaches to practice. In the Dzogchen path, which belongs to the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, the recognition that thoughts are not solid or inherently real, but are instead the natural display of a mind that is already, in its fundamental nature, clear and awake, is considered one of the most important recognitions a practitioner can arrive at. This recognition does not come from study alone. It comes from looking, from sustained, patient, intimate looking. What this long and cross-cultural history suggests is something worth sitting with quietly. Human beings across thousands of years and entirely separate civilizations, with no access to each other's texts or teachers, kept arriving at the same basic discovery: that the mind can watch itself, that this watching is different from thinking, that something is revealed in the watching that ordinary thinking tends to conceal, and that whatever is revealed is worth a life's careful attention. In recent decades, the investigation that was once carried out exclusively in meditation halls and desert hermitages has moved into another kind of room entirely, into laboratories with imaging equipment, into research universities, into the language of neuroscience. And what the scientists have found there has not contradicted what the meditators described. It has in many ways deepened the picture considerably. When a person watches their own thoughts, something measurable and specific is happening inside the brain. This is not a metaphor. The mind observing itself produces changes in neural activity that are visible on imaging scans, detectable in physiological measurements, and consistent enough across large groups of people to be studied, replicated, and built upon over time. The region of the brain most consistently associated with thought watching is the prefrontal cortex, a large expanse of neural tissue located just behind the forehead. The prefrontal cortex is involved in what researchers call executive function, the capacity to plan, to evaluate, to regulate impulses, and to monitor other mental processes. It is sometimes described informally as the brain's supervisor, the part that can observe what the rest of the brain is doing and apply some degree of deliberate oversight to it. When a person practices mindful observation of their thoughts, neuroimaging studies consistently show increased activation in the prefrontal cortex. This is the brain doing something deliberate with its attention, rather than simply generating thoughts automatically. The prefrontal cortex is, in a sense, the biological substrate of the watcher. It is the neural architecture through which awareness of thinking becomes possible. That small act of turning attention inward has a home in the brain's physiology. It is not abstract. It has a location. At the same time, something quieter is happening in a different region. The amygdala, two small almond-shaped clusters of neurons located deep in the brain's temporal lobes, is associated with the detection of threats and the generation of strong emotional reactions. In ordinary experience, when a thought with emotional charge arrives, the amygdala responds. It sounds a quiet alarm. The body tightens slightly. The attention narrows. The mind becomes more reactive. This happens very quickly, often before the conscious mind has registered the thought at all. What research consistently shows is that the practice of watching thoughts, particularly watching them with the quality of non-judgmental observation rather than with suppression or engagement, tends to reduce amygdala activation. The alarm becomes quieter, not because the difficult thought has disappeared, and not because the mind has become numb to difficulty, but because the relationship to the thought has changed. The thought is seen as a thought rather than as an immediate threat requiring immediate response. And the amygdala, receiving that slightly different signal, relaxes its urgency. This is a small shift with consequences that accumulate. Researchers at Harvard University have found that long-term meditators show measurable differences in the physical structure of certain brain regions. Specifically, areas associated with attention and interoception, meaning the awareness of one's own internal bodily states, appear to be somewhat thicker in people who have practiced for many years than in those who have not. This is an example of what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to physically reshape itself in response to repeated patterns of use. Practicing the sustained observation of internal experience, it appears, literally changes the shape of the organ that makes that observation possible. The practice leaves its mark in the most physical sense imaginable. The default mode network, that constellation of brain regions responsible for the mind's spontaneous and self-referential activity, the planning and remembering and imagining and narrating that fills most waking hours, is particularly relevant to thought-watching practice. In an unexamined mind, the default mode network tends to dominate. It runs in the background and often in the foreground of experience, generating a continuous stream of mental commentary that can feel, at times, almost like another presence in the room. Research published in 2011, conducted by a team at Yale University, found that mindfulness training significantly reduced activity in the default mode network, and that this reduction correlated with the participants' own reports of greater well-being. This is a finding worth pausing over. The reduction of default mode activity was not associated with blankness or dullness. It was associated with feeling better. The quieting of the mind's habitual self-referential activity, even partially, appears to have a measurably positive effect on subjective experience. What is particularly interesting is what happens to the default mode network in experienced meditators, even when they are not formally meditating. Studies suggest that in long-term practitioners, the default mode network shows reduced dominance even at rest, even during activities entirely unrelated to formal practice. Something in the sustained cultivation of watching appears to change the baseline from which the mind operates. Not dramatically or completely, but noticeably. The practice does not stay enclosed in the time set aside for it. It begins to permeate the rest of the day. Neuroscientist Judson Brewer, whose research has focused specifically on the relationship between mindfulness and habitual thought patterns, has found that the quality of attention brought to a difficult thought matters enormously in determining its neural impact. Specifically, approaching a difficult thought with curiosity, a kind of interested, open, and investigative attention, produces different neural outcomes than approaching it with aversion or with the attempt to push it away. Curiosity activates different neural pathways. It engages the learning centers of the brain rather than the threat detection system. It makes the difficult thought something to be understood rather than something to be escaped. The brain's capacity for metacognition, for turning attention on its own processes, is not fully developed at birth. It develops throughout childhood and adolescence, and is not considered neurologically mature until early adulthood. This developmental arc may partly explain why certain meditative practices, particularly those requiring sustained and deliberate self-observation, have traditionally been taught to adults rather than young children. The neural infrastructure through which such practice becomes possible is still assembling itself throughout the years of youth. What neuroscience has contributed to the ancient conversation about thought watching is not a reduction of the practice to mechanism. The findings do not explain away what meditators across centuries have described. They add another layer of texture to the description. The brain that watches thoughts is not simply generating an intellectual abstraction. It is doing something specific, something that changes it, something that produces measurable effects in how it responds to experience. The long investigation has found a physical home, and yet the brain, with all its measurable activity and all its illuminated scans, does not quite capture what practitioners mean when they speak of watching thoughts. For that, it is necessary to move from the language of mechanism into the language of direct experience, and to consider what a thought actually is when it becomes the object of sustained attention. To watch a thought, it helps to understand what a thought is in the context of this practice. Not what it contains, not what it is about, but what it is in itself as an object of awareness. This turns out to be a question that both contemplative traditions and modern psychology have considered very carefully, and the answers they have arrived at share a quiet family resemblance. In the Theravada Buddhist tradition, thoughts are understood to belong to one of the 5 aggregates, or khandhas, that together constitute human experience. The 5 aggregates are the physical body and its sensations, feeling tone meaning the basic quality of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral that accompanies every experience. Perception, the recognizing and categorizing of what is noticed. Mental formations, the broad category of intentional mental activity, and consciousness itself. Thoughts, in this framework, belong primarily to the category of mental formations, a Pali term, sankhara, that encompasses all the constructed, conditioned, and intentional movements of the mind. The Theravada tradition further distinguishes between wholesome and unwholesome mental formations. Wholesome formations include qualities such as kindness, equanimity, generosity, and clear seeing. Unwholesome formations include craving, aversion, restlessness, and doubt. Part of what the practice of watching thoughts develops is the capacity to recognize which kind of formation is arising, not in order to immediately eliminate the unwholesome ones, but in order to meet them clearly, without confusion about their nature. A thought known to be rooted in craving is something the mind can relate to with more steadiness than a thought experienced as simply true. The Zen tradition offers an image that has become one of the most widely used descriptions of what watching thoughts looks like from the inside. Thoughts are compared to clouds passing through a vast open sky. The clouds are real. They appear, they move, they change shape, they dissolve. But the sky in which they move is not affected by any of them. It does not become wet when the clouds become rain. It does not darken permanently when the clouds become dark. It simply holds the clouds while they pass, unchanged in its fundamental nature by whatever moves through it. This image appears not only in Zen, but in Tibetan Buddhist literature. in the poetry of the Sufi tradition, and in various strands of contemporary psychological thinking. The consistency of the image across traditions that developed independently of each other suggests that it is pointing towards something reliably true about the structure of experience. There is a quality of awareness that is more stable than the thoughts it holds. The practice of watching is, in part, the practice of learning to recognize and rest in that more stable quality. Modern psychology has developed its own vocabulary for the same territory. Cognitive behavioral therapy works with what is called cognitive diffusion, a term drawn from acceptance and commitment therapy that refers to the practice of creating distance between the thinker and the content of thoughts. In the ordinary, unfused state, a thought and its apparent truth are identical. The thought that one is not adequate enough is experienced simply as reality. In the diffused state, the same thought is seen as a mental event, something the mind is producing, which may or may not correspond to anything actual. Acceptance and commitment. Therapy offers a simple linguistic practice designed to support this shift. Rather than simply having the thought, "I am not good enough," the practitioner learns to say internally, "I am having the thought that I am not good enough." This small grammatical addition, the phrase "I am having the thought that," changes the relationship to the content significantly. The thought is still there, but there is now a person observing the thought rather than a person who is entirely the thought. That distance, slim as it is where the freedom to respond rather than react begins. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, writing in the 1890s, described consciousness as a stream, something continuous and flowing rather than discrete and episodic. He observed that the stream never quite repeats itself, that no two moments of consciousness are exactly identical, and that experience has a quality of flowing rather than of arriving in separate fixed units. Watching thoughts is, in James's terms, watching this stream from a point just slightly to the side of its current, noticing its movement without being fully carried in it. The stream continues. The watching is what is new. The Zen tradition adds another layer to the image of watching thoughts that is worth dwelling on. In Zen teaching, a thought that is met with full presence and then released is sometimes described as leaving no trace. The metaphor offered is the flight of a bird through open sky. The bird is real, its passage is real, but the sky closes after it without marking the path it took. A thought, when it is neither grasped at nor pushed away, can move through awareness in the same way. It comes, it is seen, it goes, and the awareness in which it moved remains, unmarked by its having been there. This is a description of something that does not happen easily at first. In ordinary experience, thoughts leave traces in the form of associations, which lead to other thoughts, which lead to emotional reactions, which lead back to more thoughts, producing the chains and clusters of mental activity that meditators sometimes describe with the phrase, the busy mind. The untrained mind tends to catch each passing thought and examine it, argue with it, follow it to its conclusion, lose itself inside it, and then wonder where the time went. The gradual development of the capacity to watch without grasping is exactly what practice over time offers, not as a dramatic achievement, but as a slow, almost imperceptible quieting of the mind's reflexive reaching. Some meditation teachers make a distinction between what they call sticky thoughts and transparent thoughts. Sticky thoughts are those that catch the attention and hold it, that generate immediate emotional response, that feel urgent or compelling in a way that makes them difficult to simply observe without following. Transparent thoughts are those that arise and pass without gaining significant traction, that are seen and released almost in the same moment. In the beginning stages of practice, most thoughts tend toward the sticky. With time and patience, the texture of mental activity shifts, not because the content becomes less interesting or less vivid, but because the watcher becomes more stable. The stickiness gradually diminishes, not through force, but through familiarity. Understanding the nature of thoughts as objects is useful, but it is equally important to understand the particular kinds of thoughts that move through the mind, to recognize the territories they tend to visit and the patterns they tend to trace. Because thoughts, it turns out, are not entirely random. They have characteristic habits, and those habits, once seen clearly, begin to lose some of their automatic power. One of the quieter revelations that comes from sitting with one's own mind in sustained observation is the discovery that the mind, despite its apparent freedom to go anywhere, returns to the same places again and again. The thoughts that arise are not entirely unpredictable. They sort themselves over time into recognizable territories. And learning to recognize these territories is one of the practical gifts that careful watching offers. Psychological research has identified several recurring categories of spontaneous thought in the human mind. Planning thoughts, in which the mind rehearses upcoming events, imagines how conversations might go, and prepares responses to situations that have not yet arrived. Memory recall, in which moments from the past surface without being deliberately summoned. Emotional reactions, in which the mind responds to events or to its own other thoughts with feeling. Self-referential narratives, which are thoughts about one's own identity, reputation, adequacy, relationships, and standing in the world. And fantasies or imaginative projections, in which the mind entertains scenarios that have no particular relationship to either past reality or practical planning. These categories are not rigid. They overlap, combine, and shade into each other continuously. But recognizing them even approximately changes the experience of being inside them. Planning thoughts are among the most frequent inhabitants of the ordinary mind. Research suggests that a significant proportion of waking mental activity is spent mentally rehearsing future events, imagining scenarios, and preparing for conversations or situations that will either not occur at all or will unfold in ways entirely different from what the rehearsal imagined. There is a certain earnestness to this planning. The mind does it because it genuinely believes the rehearsal will help. And sometimes it does, but much of the time, the planning is simply the mind's habitual way of relating to time, which is to be slightly ahead of where the body actually is. The body is here, the mind is tomorrow, and the gap between them is where a great deal of unnecessary discomfort quietly lives. Self-referential thinking presents its own particular territory. Thoughts about the self, about whether one is doing well or poorly, being seen clearly or misunderstood, moving in the right direction or falling behind, are among the most frequent and among the most likely to carry emotional charge. This is not surprising. The self is what the mind is most invested in protecting and understanding. But research has found a notable correlation. The more frequently and intensely a person engages in self-referential thought without the balancing awareness of a watching quality, the more likely they are to report low mood, anxiety, and a sense of disconnection from their own experience. A Harvard study that drew considerable attention when it was published in the journal Science in 2010 used a sampling method, sending messages to participants at random intervals during the day and asking what they were doing, whether their minds were on what they were doing, and how they felt. The findings were striking in their simplicity. Participants' minds were wandering from the current task approximately 47% of the time, and this mind wandering was associated with lower self-reported happiness, regardless of what the mind was wandering to, including pleasant topics. Being present to what was actually happening, whatever it was associated with feeling better than being mentally elsewhere, even when mentally elsewhere seemed more appealing than where the body was. This finding has a particular resonance in the context of watching thoughts. The mind that wanders is not a failed mind. It is a human mind doing what human minds do. But the capacity to notice the wandering, to recognize that the mind has gone somewhere other than where the body is, to feel the gap between present experience and the thought that has carried attention elsewhere, is exactly the capacity that thought watching develops. And the development of that capacity is associated, in the research, with measurable improvements in well-being. Repetitive thought patterns represent a particularly important territory in the landscape of mental activity. These are patterns in which the same or similar content circulates through awareness repeatedly, without resolution and without natural conclusion. Rumination, in which the mind returns again and again to painful past events or perceived failures, reviewing them without arriving anywhere new. Worry, in which the mind returns again and again to anticipated future difficulties, running through scenarios without finding the reassurance it is seeking. These patterns are not simply unpleasant. They are the mind working very hard at a task that thinking alone cannot complete. The mind is trying to solve something that cannot be solved by thinking more. The watching, when it arrives, is what allows the effort to finally rest. The experience of watching repetitive thoughts is different from the experience of being inside them. When the mind is fully inside a worried thought, the thought feels urgent and important, and the mind follows it willingly, believing that the next turn of the pattern will finally produce the resolution it has been seeking. When the mind watches the worried thought from the slight distance that observation creates, something else becomes visible. The pattern itself, the looping quality, the way the same phrases return with the same emotional weight, each time feeling as if they are new and urgent when in fact they have visited many times before. This recognition, simple and quiet as it is one of the most genuinely liberating things that thought-watching practice offers. Intrusive thoughts, meaning unwanted and sometimes distressing mental images or ideas that arise without invitation, are experienced by the vast majority of people, regardless of their mental health status. This is a finding that many people find genuinely reassuring when they first encounter it. The presence of an intrusive thought says nothing about the character or the desires of the person who has it. It is simply the mind generating content from its vast store of images, fears, memories, and possibilities. What matters is not the arrival of such thoughts, but the relationship the mind forms with them in the moments after their arrival. The psychologist Stanley Rachman conducted research in the 1970s that demonstrated something important about the relationship between thought watching and thought control. Attempts to suppress unwanted thoughts, the deliberate effort to push them out of awareness, reliably increased the frequency with which those thoughts returned. This became known as the rebound effect. The mind instructed not to think about something tends to think about it more, not less. The instruction itself keeps the content alive in the background of awareness, where the monitoring process checks repeatedly to confirm that the forbidden thought has indeed been successfully avoided. The psychologist Daniel Wegner later described this in terms of what he called ironic process theory. The mental process that monitors for the forbidden thought, checking to see whether it has been successfully suppressed, is itself a form of thinking about the thought, and that monitoring thought keeps the forbidden content active in the background of awareness. Watching a thought without suppressing it turns out to be more effective than suppressing it, not because the thought becomes more welcome, but because it is no longer being powered by the monitoring process that attempted to banish it. The watcher that accepts the thought as a thought without believing it or fighting it discovers that the thought has less energy than it appeared to have. It passes, and the passing is a relief. Understanding the categories of thoughts, the kinds of mental activity that tend to arise, and the patterns they tend to follow is an important part of developing the capacity to watch clearly. But the formal practice of thought watching, the deliberate sitting with one's own mind in a structured and supportive context, offers something that intellectual understanding alone cannot provide. It offers the lived experience of watching, sustained and patient and accumulated over time. When a person sits down to meditate, they are doing something that has been done in broadly similar ways for thousands of years. The posture may vary. The cushion or the bench or the chair may be different. The tradition in which the instruction is rooted may use different vocabulary, but the essential act is the same. The body settles. The external activity of the day is set aside. The attention is directed inward, and the practice of watching what arises in the mind begins. In most forms of sitting meditation, the instruction given to the watcher of thoughts is one that takes some time to fully absorb. It is not the instruction to prevent thoughts from arising. Thoughts will arise. They always do. The instruction, rather, is to notice the thoughts as they come, to recognize them as thoughts, and to return the attention to a chosen anchor point, typically the physical sensation of breathing, when the mind has been drawn away by its own content. This cycle of noticing distraction and returning to the anchor is the basic unit of practice, and it is repeated many thousands of times over the course of a sustained practice life. The anchor is not the goal of practice. This is a point worth understanding clearly. The breath is not what the meditator is ultimately trying to attend to. The breath is a reference point, a steady, reliable, always present object of attention that makes it possible to notice when the mind has wandered. It is the edge of the map, not the destination. When the mind loses itself in a thought and then returns to the breath, the return itself is the moment of practice, the noticing that attention had gone somewhere. and the gentle decision to bring it back is where the watching actually lives. In the Theravada tradition of Vipassana meditation, a specific technique was developed and systematized to support this watching process. It is called the noting technique, and it involves the gentle and minimal labeling of mental events as they arise. When a thought appears, the meditator notes it with a soft internal word, thinking. When the mind is making plans, planning. When memory is surfacing, remembering. When the body calls attention to itself with a sensation, sensation. These labels are not analytical or evaluative. They are minimal recognitions, just enough to name what is happening without elaborating or engaging with the content. The noting technique was systematized by the Burmese meditation teacher Mahasi Sayadaw in the 20th century, and it has since been taught widely across the Theravada and insight meditation traditions. Its purpose is practical and precise. The note creates a small but reliable gap between the experience of a thought and complete immersion in it. When the mind notes planning, it is simultaneously planning and watching the planning. The two are not identical. And in the gap between them, the capacity for clear observation begins to develop and, over time, to strengthen. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition offers a related but distinctly different approach within the Mahamudra teachings. Mahamudra, a Tibetan word meaning the Great Seal, points to the fundamental nature of mind as it is, without need for elaboration or modification. In this tradition, practitioners at certain stages of development are sometimes instructed not to note, label, or manipulate thoughts in any way. Not to follow them, not to suppress them, not to analyze them, and not even to note them. Instead, the instruction is to rest in the awareness that is already present, the natural and open awareness that is there before any thought arises and continues when the thought has passed, and to allow thoughts to arise and dissolve within that awareness without any particular relationship being formed with them. This approach rests on a particular understanding of the nature of thoughts. In the Mahamudra teaching, a thought that is neither grasped nor rejected undergoes what is called self-liberation. The thought arises, moves through the open awareness, and dissolves without needing any intervention from the meditator. It unties itself. This is compared to a knot in a rope that loosens when the rope is held without any additional tension. The thought, given the spacious awareness of a mind that does not reach for it or push it away, completes itself naturally and passes. This is not passivity. It is the result of a very particular and refined quality of attention. In Zen Buddhism, an entirely different kind of practice engages the relationship between thought and the awareness of thought. The koan, a short question or paradox traditionally posed by a teacher to a student, is designed specifically to interrupt the ordinary operations of thought. A koan cannot be answered by thinking. The more the thinking mind tries to solve it, the more clearly the thinking mind's limitations become visible. The koan is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a means of revealing the awareness that exists prior to problem-solving thought. One of the most commonly encountered of these questions asks simply, who is the one who is aware of the thoughts? This is not a question that points to an answer in the ordinary sense. It points past answers, to the awareness that is already present before any answer can be formulated. It cannot be answered by thinking about it. It can only be approached by watching, carefully and with patience, the quality of the one who is already watching. The question is the practice. The watching is the answer. Many practitioners, particularly in the beginning stages of formal practice, expect that the goal is to reach a state of thoughtless stillness, a mind entirely empty of content, serene and blank, in a way that would be immediately recognizable as profound. This expectation, though understandable, tends to create a particular kind of difficulty. The mind is evaluated against an impossible standard. Every thought that arises is treated as a failure. The practice becomes a struggle rather than an inquiry. What teachers across traditions consistently describe is something quite different. The goal of sitting practice, insofar as it can be described as a goal, is not the cessation of thought. It is the development of a different relationship with thought. Long-term practitioners often report that their thoughts do not become fewer or less varied or less surprising. What changes is the pull that thoughts exert. A thought that once arrived with the authority of a command, demanding immediate response, becomes something that can be seen, recognized, and allowed to pass. The thought is still fully present. The grip it has on the watcher has loosened. The return to the anchor after noticing distraction is the heart of formal practice, and it is worth sitting with the image of that return for a moment. In a single session of 30 or 40 minutes, a meditator may return hundreds of times. Each return involves a moment of recognition, the noticing that the mind had gone somewhere, and a gentle redirection of attention. Each of these moments is complete in itself. There is no accumulation of credit for returns that happened earlier in the session. Each return is fresh, each noticing is new, and the practice lives entirely in this present noticing, this present return, this single quiet breath of awareness arriving home. What happens in the formal structure of sitting practice does not stay enclosed within it. The watching that develops on the cushion or the chair begins, over time, to move into the rest of the day, not as a technique being deliberately applied, but as a natural quality of the mind that has been cultivated enough to begin operating on its own. In the kitchen, on the walk between one place and another, in the middle of an ordinary and unremarkable afternoon. The formal practice of sitting down and deliberately watching the mind is, for most practitioners, where the investigation begins. But the early Buddhist texts that describe the foundations of mindfulness were careful to make clear that formal practice was not the only context in which thought-watching had a place. Informal mindfulness, the sustained observation of mental activity during the ordinary movements of daily life, was described as equally important to formal seated practice. Not supplementary to it, equal to it. The investigation belongs to the whole of the day. This understanding is embedded in the very structure of monastic life in many Buddhist traditions. In the Zen tradition, the concept of samu refers to work practice, the bringing of a meditative quality of attention to the physical labor of the monastery. Cleaning, cooking, gardening, carrying water, these tasks are not understood as interruptions to practice. They are practice, expressed through the body in motion rather than the body at rest. The quality of attention brought to sweeping a corridor is considered, in principle, identical to the quality of attention brought to sitting in the meditation hall. The corridor and the hall are, in this understanding, the same room. This is the meaning of the phrase that the Zen tradition has offered most widely to the world beyond its walls. Before understanding, chop wood, and carry water. After understanding chop wood and carry water, the tasks do not change. What changes is the quality of presence in which they are carried out. The wood chopped by a mind that is fully present is the same wood chopped by a mind that is absent and preoccupied. But the experience of chopping it is entirely different. And, the teaching suggests, the person doing the chopping is also different, in ways that are real even if they are not visible from the outside. Watching thoughts during conversation presents a particular and interesting challenge. Conversation is perhaps the context in which the mind's tendency to leave the present moment is most consistently reinforced rather than discouraged. In the ordinary flow of dialogue, the mind begins forming its response while the other person is still speaking. This is so habitual, so widely shared, and so rarely questioned that it is simply taken as the normal way that conversation works. Noticing this tendency, becoming aware that the mind has moved from listening to preparing, is itself a form of thought watching, and it is a form that changes something in the quality of presence that one person can offer another. Listening that is actually listening is rarer than it appears, and it is received differently when it occurs. The body is an important ally in watching thoughts during daily life. Body sensations often precede the full conscious formation of a thought, offering an early signal that a particular mental pattern is activating. A slight tightening in the chest, a rise in the shoulders, a quickening of the breath, or a subtle holding of it, a shift in the quality of alertness in the stomach. These physical changes often accompany thoughts associated with anxiety, reactivity, or the approach of a difficult emotional state. Learning to notice the body's signal before the thought has fully formed is one of the most practical skills that informal thought watching develops. The body is already watching. The practice is learning to receive what it has been saying all along. A practice that bridges the formal and informal dimensions of thought watching is what many teachers describe as the mindful pause. Before entering a room, the practitioner pauses for a breath and notices what the mind is currently carrying. Before sending a message that has been written in a state of strong feeling, there is a pause to observe what is driving the words. Before responding in a moment of interpersonal tension, there is the small act of noticing what the mind is doing before the mouth does something with it. These pauses are brief. They do not require retreating from the situation or adopting a particular posture. They require only the willingness to introduce a moment of watching between the feeling and the action. Research published in the journal Psychological Science found that even brief mindfulness training improved participants' ability to notice mind wandering in real time. This is significant because the capacity to notice that the mind has wandered is precisely the capacity that makes informal thought watching possible. Without the noticing, the mind can wander for long stretches without any recognition that it has done so. The person arrives somewhere, at the end of a meal or a walk or a conversation, and genuinely cannot account for the previous several minutes of mental life. The development of this noticing, which formal practice initiates and informal practice extends into daily life, is the foundational skill from which everything else in thought watching grows. Many contemplative traditions support informal thought watching through brief and regular practices woven into the texture of the day. A small bell or chime that sounds at intervals and invites a moment of return. the habit of taking 3 conscious breaths before a meal, the gesture of placing a hand at rest before entering a difficult conversation, the pause at the threshold of a room. These small interruptions to the ordinary flow of automatic activity are not interruptions in a negative sense. They are deliberate openings in the stream of automaticity, tiny moments in which the watcher remembers itself and notices what is present. The Japanese concept of MR offers a useful image for the quality of these pauses. Ma refers to meaningful space or pause in art, architecture, music, and speech. It is not emptiness. It is the space between 2 notes that gives the music its shape, the space between 2 columns that gives the architecture its proportion, the pause in conversation that allows what has been said to fully land before the next thing is spoken. A mindful pause in thought has something of this quality. It is the space in which the watching can occur. Without it, the stream of mental activity has no openings, no places where the light of awareness can enter. What many practitioners report over the course of consistent informal practice is a gradual and quiet shift in the texture of ordinary experience. Tasks begin to feel more fully inhabited rather than merely performed. The distance between the person and their own activity narrows in a way that is difficult to describe, but easy to notice when it has begun to happen. Washing dishes becomes, occasionally, simply washing dishes, rather than a backdrop against which the mind rehearses tomorrow's conversation. A walk becomes sometimes an actual walk, rather than a moving venue for planning, remembering, and evaluating. This shift does not arrive all at once, and it does not remain permanently once it has arrived. It comes and goes. It is stronger on some days than others. It is available more readily in some situations than others. But its presence, even intermittent, changes the relationship to daily life in ways that accumulate quietly over time. The mind becomes gradually more familiar with what it is like to be here, in the actual present, rather than in the constructed one that thinking tends to prefer. Watching thoughts during daily life reveals something that formal practice also reveals, but that becomes particularly vivid in the midst of ordinary experience. That thoughts and emotions are deeply and intimately entangled. That a thought often arrives wrapped in a feeling, and a feeling often arrives accompanied by a thought. And that watching carefully enough to see both, and to understand something of the relationship between them, is one of the most practically useful things the practice of thought watching can offer. Thoughts and emotions are close neighbors in the landscape of inner experience. They are related, deeply so, but they are not identical. A thought is a mental event, the arising of content in the mind, an image or a word or a narrative or a plan. An emotion is something more complex, a blend of physiological arousal in the body, felt sensation in the chest and the throat and the stomach and the limbs, and an interpretive layer in the mind that gives the arousal its name and its story. The two arrive together so reliably that it can be difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. Part of what careful thought watching reveals is the seam between them. The psychologist Aaron Beck, whose work in the 1960s formed the foundation of cognitive therapy, proposed something that has since been supported by extensive research. He observed that between any external event and the emotional response it produces, there is a layer of interpretation, a rapid and automatic thought that evaluates the event and determines its emotional meaning. These automatic thoughts, as he named them, are not usually conscious in the ordinary sense. They arise too quickly and too habitually to be noticed without deliberate attention. They feel, to the person having them, like perception rather than interpretation, like seeing rather than judging. And that feeling of certainty, of simply perceiving what is real, is precisely what makes them so influential. The work of cognitive therapy is, in large part, the work of slowing down this rapid process enough to see the automatic thought before accepting it as fact. This is a therapeutic form of what contemplative traditions have always called watching thoughts. The thought that tells a person they have been insulted produces anger. The thought that tells a person they have been rejected produces grief. The thought that tells a person something dangerous is near produces fear. None of these thoughts are necessarily inaccurate, but none of them are necessarily accurate either. They are interpretations happening at great speed in a mind that has learned particular ways of reading the world. Watching them is the beginning of having some choice in how they proceed. The body is a participant in this process from the very beginning, and often arrives before the conscious thought does. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio proposed what he called the somatic marker hypothesis, which describes how emotional responses leave physical traces in the body that precede and inform conscious reasoning. The body, in this view, is not simply responding to the mind's conclusions. It is generating information that the mind then interprets. The tight chest before an important meeting. The warmth in the face before the recognition of embarrassment. The heaviness in the limbs that accompanies sadness. These are not symptoms of emotional states. They are, in a real sense, part of the emotional state itself. Watching thoughts well means learning to watch the body as well. This is not incidental. It is built directly into the structure of traditional mindfulness practice, which, as the Theravada Satipatthana teachings describe, begins with the body as its first domain of observation, before moving to feeling tones, states of mind, and mental objects. The body is the first and most basic field of awareness, and it is the field in which emotional life is most reliably found when the narrative mind is not yet sure what to make of what is happening. The body knows before the mind does, and that knowledge, gently attended to, is one of the most reliable guides the practice offers. Different emotional states generate characteristic patterns of thought. Grief tends to produce repetitive memories, searching thoughts, the mental rehearsal of what was and what is no longer. Anxiety tends to produce threat-related planning, the rapid scanning of scenarios for possible dangers, the mental preparation for outcomes that may never occur. Anger tends to produce justification, the building of a case, the searching for evidence that the anger is warranted. Watching these patterns, not to change them or dismiss them, but to recognize them as patterns, allows the person inside them to maintain some access to perspective, even in the middle of strong feeling. The storm is still present. The watcher is also present, watching the storm from somewhere slightly inside the shelter. Researchers at the University of California, Los Angeles, conducted studies that produced a finding with significant implications for the practice of thought watching. They found that the act of labeling an emotional state in words, the simple act of naming what is being felt, produced a measurable reduction in activation in the amygdala. The act of noting internally, "This is anxiety" or "This is grief," changed the physiological signature of the emotion. The naming, the watching made verbal, appears to shift the brain's relationship to the emotional content. This process is called affect labeling in the research literature, and it is one of the most consistently replicated findings in the area of mindfulness and emotional regulation. The act of labeling does not make the emotion disappear. It does not resolve the situation that produced it or eliminate the feeling from the body. What it does is introduce the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain associated with deliberate attention and self-regulation, into a process that was previously happening entirely in the older and more reactive regions of the brain. The watcher enters the process, and the process changes in response. Something about being seen clearly, even only by oneself, changes the quality of what is happening. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition offers a different but compatible understanding of the relationship between thought, emotion, and the practice of watching. In Tibetan Buddhist teaching, emotions are not regarded as obstacles to practice, as problems to be resolved before the real work can begin. They are understood as powerful energies, vivid and alive, that become confusing and harmful when not recognized clearly and become sources of insight when they are. The energy of anger, when watched clearly and without being acted upon, contains within it the clarity of a mirror. The energy of desire, when observed rather than followed, contains within it the capacity to appreciate beauty without grasping. The transformation is not about neutralizing the energy, but about recognizing it clearly enough to relate to it differently. Tibetan teaching describes this as transmutation, the process by which the energy of a difficult emotion is not discarded, but redirected through the quality of awareness brought to it. This is not a metaphor for suppression. It is essentially the same process that modern neuroscience is describing when it notes that the quality of attention brought to a difficult thought or feeling changes its neural signature. Clear seeing changes what is seen, not by altering its content, but by altering the relationship in which it is held. Many practitioners report a particular experience that comes with watching the body and thought connection over time. When a difficult emotion arises and attention is brought to its physical dimension rather than its narrative content, the story tends to lose some of its insistence. The emotion is still present, often fully and vividly so. But the narrative that accompanies it, the case being built, the meanings being assigned, the rehearsals and justifications being conducted, becomes slightly less automatic. There is more space between the feeling and the story. And in that space, the possibility of a different response begins. Not forced, not performed, but genuinely available in a way it was not before. To watch a thought clearly is also, in some sense, to begin to understand what a thought actually is at its most basic level. What it is made of, where it comes from, and why it has the particular qualities it does. This is a question that neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy have all approached with genuine seriousness. And what they have found, each from its own angle of investigation, is both illuminating and, in some ways, quietly surprising. A thought, at its most basic level of description, is a pattern of neural activity, a rapid and coordinated firing of neurons distributed across multiple brain regions, producing something that is experienced from the inside as a mental image or a word or a felt sense or an idea or a plan. This description is accurate and useful. It is also, in a very particular way, incomplete, because the experience of having a thought does not feel like neural activity. It feels like something being understood, remembered, imagined, or known. The gap between the mechanical description and the lived experience of thinking is genuine, and it remains one of the most honestly puzzling territories in contemporary science. Thoughts arise from memory, perception, and imagination in constantly shifting combinations. Very few thoughts are purely one category or another. A thought about tomorrow's conversation draws on memory of previous conversations, perception of the current situation, and imagination of possible futures, all assembled in a single moment of mental activity into something that feels like a coherent unit of experience. That assembly is happening continuously and mostly without any awareness that it is happening. The watching of thoughts is, in part, the slow development of awareness of the assembly process itself, rather than just its products. Watching behind the thought toward its origins is one of the more interesting extensions of the practice. Language and thought are deeply intertwined in human experience, but they are not identical. Many thoughts arrive first as wordless impressions, as images or bodily felt senses or emotional tones, and only acquire verbal form afterward, as the mind moves to articulate what it has already in some sense known. Other thoughts arrive directly in words, as a kind of inner speech that uses the same channels as spoken language. The experience of inner speech varies considerably among individuals. Some people experience their thoughts primarily as a verbal voice in the head. Others experience them more visually, as images or scenes. Still others report a more diffuse and impressionistic quality to their thinking, more felt than seen or heard. The practice of watching is, among other things, the practice of becoming familiar with the particular texture of one's own thinking. Research on inner speech, the experience of a private verbal voice in the mind, has produced some findings that are both counterintuitive and illuminating. The Russian developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, writing in the early decades of the 20th century, proposed that inner speech develops from external speech in childhood. The child who talks to themselves while working through a task is, in Vygotsky's view, externalizing a process that will gradually be internalized as the child develops. The voice one eventually thinks in as an adult is, in part, assembled from the voices of the people who surrounded one in childhood. It is a borrowed instrument that becomes one's own through years of use. This idea has a particular quality when the thought watcher encounters it. The voice in the head, the one narrating the day, evaluating the options, rehearsing the conversations, building the cases and the plans and the self-assessments, is not entirely one's own in the way it feels as though it is. It is partly constructed from the outside world, from language heard and absorbed before there was any conscious awareness of absorbing it. Watching this voice, noticing its characteristic phrases and its recurring concerns and its particular way of framing events, is partly the practice of recognizing how much of what feels like inner truth is actually inner inheritance. Something received long ago, from people and places that are no longer present, still speaking. Memory and imagination use many of the same neural structures. This has been established clearly enough in neuroscience research that it now influences how both processes are understood. When a person remembers an event from the past, the brain does not play back a stored recording. It reconstructs the event from stored fragments, assembling it fresh each time, with the reconstruction shaped by what the person knows now, feels now, and expects now. The memory is real, but it is not fixed. It is a constructed version of the past, created in the present, by a mind that is always working with the materials currently available to it. Similarly, when a person imagines a future event, they do not access a library of possibilities stored somewhere in the brain. They construct a scenario from the same stored fragments that memories are assembled from. The imagined future is built of remembered material. This means that thoughts about what has happened are partly invented, and thoughts about what will happen are partly remembered. Both are more provisional than they feel. Both are the mind's best attempt at a picture, not the picture itself. Watching thoughts with this understanding available changes what the watching reveals. The thought that feels like a reliable report begins to be seen as one of many possible constructions assembled from available pieces, rather than as a fixed and unquestionable fact. In Buddhist philosophy across several traditions, a thought is described not as a thing, but as a process. This is not simply a semantic distinction. It points to something important about the nature of mental events. A thing, in the ordinary sense of the word, exists at a location in space and persists in time with some stability. A thought is different. It does not exist the way a stone exists. It arises in dependence on conditions, the state of the nervous system, the memories and associations currently active, the current sensory environment, the emotional weather of the moment. It persists briefly. It changes as it persists, and then it passes, leaving in its wake only a trace in memory, and, if it has been frequently enough repeated, a deepening groove in the brain's habitual patterns. The thought is an event, not an object, and events, unlike objects, pass. The experimental work of neuroscientist Benjamin Libet in the 1980s generated considerable discussion about the relationship between thought, intention, and neural activity. Libet's experiments appear to show that the brain begins preparing for a voluntary movement slightly before the person becomes consciously aware of intending to make that movement. The brain, in these experiments, seemed to know what was coming before the conscious mind did. This was interpreted by some as suggesting that what feels like a conscious decision to act is, in at least some circumstances, a recognition of a process that was already underway before the recognition occurred. For thought-watching practice, what this suggests is not a diminishment of the watcher, but a deepening of curiosity about when and how awareness enters the process. If some thoughts are already forming before conscious recognition of them, then one of the things that sustained watching develops is a finer-grained sensitivity to the earlier stages. The slight movement before the full thought, the precursor to the word, the physical sensation that announces the thought before the thought has quite arrived in conscious form. Long-term meditators sometimes describe exactly this kind of refined sensitivity, a noticing of thoughts just as they begin, rather than only after they have fully formed and taken their characteristic shape. Knowing something of what thoughts are made of, where they come from, and how they move through the mind, invites a final and perhaps the most practically important question. What is the quality of watching that the practice is trying to cultivate? Not just the act of watching, which can be done in many different ways, but the particular quality that makes the watching useful, clear, and, in time, genuinely transforming. Not all watching is the same. The person who watches a thought with impatience, wanting it to be different or to leave, is watching. The person who watches a thought with fascination, getting drawn into its content and following it without quite realizing they have done so, is also watching, in a different and somewhat less stable way. The person who watches with a quality of open, steady, interested attention that neither reaches toward the thought nor pulls away from it is watching in the way that practice is pointing toward. The distinction is not about effort. It is about the particular texture of the awareness doing the watching. Across traditions and across the vocabulary of contemporary psychology, several qualities of watching appear consistently as being most conducive to the practice. The first is stability. Stability of attention means that the watching does not immediately follow the thought wherever the thought goes. The thought arises, the watching notices it, and the watching remains in place rather than being carried away. This is different from rigidity or suppression. The thought is fully seen, but the seeing does not become the being inside the thought. There is a distinction, however small and however frequently lost and found again, between the thought and the awareness of it. The Pali term samatha, often translated into English as calm abiding or tranquility, describes a particular quality of meditative stability. In the Theravada tradition, samatha is understood as the cultivation of a collected and settled quality of mind, one that has been gathered rather than scattered, that rests in its object of attention with some ease rather than with constant effort. It is not the dramatic concentration of someone pressing their attention toward a target. It is more like the settled quality of a pond after the ripples have subsided. The water is still responsive. It will ripple again when something touches it. But in the interval between disturbances, it is clear and still enough to reflect what is present with accuracy. Clarity is the second quality that appears consistently in descriptions of effective thought watching. Clarity means seeing the thought distinctly rather than vaguely, recognizing it as the particular kind of mental event it is, without either magnifying it or glossing over it. A thought seen clearly is a thought seen in proportion, neither given more weight than it carries, nor dismissed before it has been fully received. In the Tibetan tradition of Dzogchen, there is a term, rigpa, that is sometimes translated as pure awareness or pristine consciousness. It describes a quality of knowing that is clear in a particular way, not the clarity of sharp analysis, but the clarity of an unobstructed view, like seeing through glass that has been cleaned, where previously the glass itself was what was being looked at without knowing it. Equanimity is the third quality, and it is perhaps the one most often misunderstood. Equanimity is not indifference. It is not the flattening of experience into a neutral grey. It is not the absence of feeling or the removal of response. Equanimity, as it is described in Buddhist teaching across multiple traditions, is a balanced quality of attention that can hold both pleasant and unpleasant experience without tipping toward craving for more of the pleasant or aversion toward the unpleasant. The pleasant thought is noticed. The unpleasant thought is noticed. Neither is chased. Neither is fled from. Both are held in the same clear and steady quality of attention. This is a practice rather than a state, something cultivated through continuous gentle returning, rather than something arrived at once and kept forever. Curiosity appears in the work of contemporary meditation teachers and researchers as perhaps the most practically accessible of all the qualities associated with effective thought watching. Research has consistently found that approaching difficult thoughts and difficult emotional states with curious interest, with a genuine wondering about their qualities, their movements, their textures, changes the neural landscape of those experiences. Curiosity activates the brain's learning systems rather than its threat detection systems. It engages the investigative mind rather than the defensive one. A difficult thought approached with curiosity becomes something to be understood rather than something to be escaped. And understanding, even partial and tentative, is a form of freedom. In the insight meditation tradition, which draws primarily on Theravada sources and was developed for practitioners through the work of teachers, including those who brought these teachings to the West in the latter part of the 20th century, the instruction to observe thoughts with what was described by the Burmese teacher Sayadaw U Pandita as bare attention has been central. Bare attention means attention without elaboration, without commentary, without evaluation. The thought is seen. It is noted simply and minimally, and attention returns to its anchor. Nothing is added to the thought by the watching. The watching does not analyze, embellish, resist, or approve. It simply witnesses. This simplicity, demanding as it turns out to be in practice, is the quality toward which a great deal of the formal training is pointing. What changes over time in a consistent practice of thought watching is something that is difficult to describe from the outside, but widely and consistently reported from the inside. The distinction between the one who is watching and the thoughts being watched becomes more familiar and more stable. In the early stages of practice, the watcher is often quite thin, quite easily lost. Disappearing into the thought, it is attempting to observe within moments of the thoughts arising. The identification with thought is so habitual and so thorough that the watching can barely establish itself before it has been absorbed again. This is the ordinary experience of beginning practice, and it is not a cause for discouragement. It is simply what an early stage of any serious cultivation looks like. With time and consistency, something shifts. Not dramatically, and not all at once. The watcher becomes more reliable. The awareness of being aware becomes easier to find and easier to maintain. Thoughts still arise, as they always have and always will, but they arise into a space that is, gradually, somewhat more spacious than before. The thought is still fully present. The watching is also fully present. And the relationship between them is not one of conflict or suppression, but of clear and steady recognition. The thought is here. The watching is here. They are not the same thing. Many teachers describe the deepening of this recognition in terms that point towards something more fundamental than a change in mental technique. They describe the gradual recognition of what does not change within experience. Thoughts change constantly, moods change, sensations change. The contents of consciousness are in continuous movement, like the surface of water that is always and only in motion, never precisely still, never exactly repeating. But within, or as the ground of all this movement, something else is noticed. The awareness in which the movement is occurring appears to remain, not as a thought or a mood or a sensation, but as the field in which all of these arise and pass, unchanged in its fundamental nature by any of them. This recognition, variously called resting in awareness, or recognizing the natural state, or simply knowing that one is knowing, is described in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as perhaps the most direct form of practice available. It does not require the manipulation of thought. It does not require any special state to be achieved or any particular content to be cultivated. It requires only the recognition of what is already present, the awareness that has been here all along, noticing everything that has passed through it, unchanged in its fundamental nature by any of it. The simplest description of the whole of thought-watching practice may also be the most accurate one. It is the practice of remembering, again and again, that one is not only the thought, one is also the one who is noticing. That noticing, quiet and patient, and steadily available through all the weather of the mind, is perhaps the most reliable thing the human investigation of inner life has ever discovered. Not as a conclusion, as a beginning, as something to return to again and again across a lifetime of looking. As the night settles more fully around you, let everything we have moved through this evening begin to soften at its edges. We began somewhere very close, closer perhaps than most journeys begin. We turned towards something that was already happening, already present, already moving through the space behind the eyes. We looked at the long and serious human investigation that has circled this same territory for thousands of years, finding the same quiet discovery in desert hermitages and Burmese meditation halls and Roman private journals and Lithuanian study houses, all pointing in the same direction with different hands. We sat with what neuroscience has found in the illuminated machinery of the brain, where the act of watching a thought leaves its own measurable trace in the tissue that makes watching possible. We considered what a thought actually is when held at the slight distance that observation creates. Not a solid thing, not an absolute truth, a passing event assembled from memory and language and the long inheritance of other people's voices, moving through a space that was here before the thought arrived and remains when the thought has gone. We traveled through the particular territories the mind tends to visit, the planning and the remembering, the repetitive loops, the intrusive visitors that carry no real authority. We sat inside formal practice, where the returning to the anchor turns out to be the whole of the work, rather than a detour from it. We followed the practice out into the kitchen and the conversation and the walk between rooms, where the same watching that lives in the meditation hall begins, slowly, to live everywhere. We felt the body's early warnings, the tightening that arrives before the thought has fully formed, and understood that the body has been watching all along. We asked what thoughts are made of, and found that they are more borrowed, more constructed, more provisional than they feel. And we arrived, at the end, at the simplest and perhaps the most important thing of all. The one who is watching is also real. The watcher and the thought are not the same. That recognition does not need to be held onto tonight. The mind will keep what it is ready for. It always does. Let the facts and the histories and the brain regions and the Pali words dissolve gently into the background, the way the details of a landscape dissolve when you step back far enough to see only its shape. If these slow evenings with the sleepy mind are something you find yourself returning to, you are warmly welcome to leave a like or subscribe or add a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps more tired and curious people find their way here, one soft night at a time. And if sleep has not yet arrived, there is another gentle journey waiting on the screen when you are ready. But if your eyes are already heavy, let them close. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders release whatever they have been carrying since morning. Let your hands rest exactly where they are, without needing to hold anything. Let your breath find its own pace, its own rhythm, the one it has always known. You do not need to watch your thoughts tonight with any particular skill. You only need to let them move through, the way weather moves through open sky. They are passing. Everything is passing. And you are here, quietly, watching. Sleep well, and good night.